And now, sitting in for John Harchar.
Yes, America's Keep On Grooving host is away. This is your undocumented guest host, no supporting paperwork whatsoever. This is actually part of the Keep On Grooving Foreign Exchange program, really wonderful program. In it, foreigners with sinister sounding accents take over your podcast, and in return, experienced Hendrix doesn't get cleared for some of the clips in the documentary, so the thing is put on ice for a few years. But it's all cleared up, the set is out, so let's get to it. Episode 50, Electric Lady Studios, a Jimi Hendrix Vision. We are live at Joint Base KOG in central New Jersey. For those of you fleeing the Garden State to head across to Delaware to pump your own gas and get some free plastic bags at the grocery store, you can't miss us. Big sign on Route 1, last Keep On Grooving guest host before the Pennsylvania border, so do swing by and say hello. And be sure to wave at the drones flying by. It's the season of guest hosts, and we're no different here at Keep On Grooving, and especially on this day in particular. With the recent release of the Electric Lady Studios box set, what better day to talk about it than a day Americans have no clue about? Yes, I mean Boxing Day. Okay, that's enough. Whew. Where the heck did Mark Stein get that accent from anyway? We've done the audio parts of the box set, so now it's time for the video and the story of how Jimi came to get his own studio in the heart of Greenwich Village. The club actually has its origins back in the 20s and 30s when it was known as the Village Barn and was partially owned by crooner Rudy Valley. And I used to think my Jack Benny and Rochester references on Left Turn at Albuquerque are out of date. Eesh. By the time the 60s came around, the club had been renamed the Generation Club and was the site of a famous jam between Jimi and B.B. King, which is out there in an audience recording. However, the club closed soon after this. It didn't have a liquor license, and you couldn't make a go of things down there without one. Manager Mike Jeffrey, ever the deal maker, sometimes not so good ones, convinced Jimi to go in on buying the club, reopen it, and maybe have a little recording studio in the back. The recording costs for Electric Ladyland had piled up quickly, so the thought was to have a place where Jimi could go and do his thing without piling up additional costs. They hired up-and-coming architect John Storick to do the plans. He was a Princeton graduate and had done an off-the-wall club named Cerebrum that Jimi sometimes frequented. So he got hired and began diligently working on plans for a nightclub and studio in one. Then two voices of reason chimed in, the first being Scene Club manager Jim Marin, not to be confused with the voice of Gypsy. Richard Basart. Jeffrey ended up convincing him to join their project, but he said the nightclub portion was not feasible. At the time, the village club scene was run by certain individuals who had vowels at the end of their names, and many of them with the middle name The. Since they didn't have many friends like them in their sphere, the club may have met with an unfortunate incident. Nice club, would have been a shame if something had happened to it. The other voice chiming in on kiboshing the nightclub was Eddie Kramer. His reaction is one of my all-time favorites. When told of the plans to have a loud, noisy nightclub right next to a small little recording studio, he famously said, "You guys are nuts!" He said they should scrap the whole nightclub idea and make a great state-of-the-art studio, top-of-the-line equipment and everything. That way Jimi could get work done, and then when he was out, other artists could come in and record, giving an additional income stream. So the decision was made to scrap the nightclub and do the whole thing as a studio. Now someone just had to tell John. He got the call to scrap everything he was doing and start over. Wasn't exactly thrilled with the development, but went right to work on the new plan, which of course added more to the cost of the project. It was also an issue that he never designed or built the studio, but Kramer and Marin brought in several experienced hands from the New York studio and club scene to help out. This included a couple of assistant engineers who were also musicians, Kim King, who was the guitarist for Lothar and the Hand People, and Dave Palmer, drummer for the Amboy Dukes. In the meantime, demolition work began, which yielded another unexpected occurrence. When they broke down some of the walls and floors in the basement, it soon began to flood with water. The club sat over an unusual natural feature of lower Manhattan called the Minetta River. Minetta Lane in the village is named after it. What makes it unusual is it's totally underground. I mean, you're not driving up 6th Avenue and go across the Minetta River Bridge. You drive right over it and never even know it. Most people don't even know it exists. The crew working on the site found out about it in a hurry. This not only led to the area having to be drained, but the additional cost of fixing cracked pipes, sump pumps having to be installed, and those being sound insulated so every recording wouldn't be graced by a constant hum, which of course added even more to the cost of the project. Now, of course, this was the era where Jimi wasn't exactly at his most productive in the studio. The experience with breaking up and unable to come up with a solid recording of, well, anything. Even though in hindsight, some of the recordings from late 68 and 1969 are actually pretty good. Then there was the whole PPX situation, which led a court to reward a future album of Jimi's to producer Ed Chopin and Capitol Records, all over an earlier contract he'd signed for the grand total of $1. Did Randolph and Mortimer Duke negotiate that deal? So with album revenues not able to offset the cost of the studio, there was only one thing they could do: head out onto the road. So the spring of 1969 was for the most part spent out on the road, even though the band was not really on good speaking terms. As we went over in a previous episode, despite this, they were generally doing a solid job putting on a decent show. The issue was the sheer number of shows and their closeness to one another time-wise. Distance-wise, they did end up clumping things together without being too far apart. I mean, he wasn't doing California one night and Texas or Iowa the next, but it was still a lot of traveling. It did, however, get the bills paid in a very hand-to-mouth fashion. Maron would pay the crew on Friday afternoon, sometimes with the help of loans from other club owners. Jimi would play 2 or 3 concerts over the weekend, and by Sunday night or Monday morning, he'd come back with piles of cash. The LA Forum show was particularly lucrative, netting them over $100,000. And remember, they also had the Oakland show the next day as well, so that was probably a good weekend for him. After the experience broke up, Jimi did spend time in the studio with various bands. With the Woodstock Band, aka Gypsy Sons and Rainbows, he did some recording at the Hit Factory. With Band of Gypsies, they recorded in the record plant, rehearsed for the concerts at Baggy's, and Jimi and Eddie mixed the eventual album at Juggy's. This led to a terrible cash drain where construction would stop for long periods of time. Eventually, Jeffrey and Maron worked out a deal with Reprise to get a loan from them based on future album revenues. It got them the cash to continue working on the studio, but now there was another responsibility hoisted onto the already stretched and stressed Hendrix. When Mitch returned in the spring of 1970, he, Jimi, and Billy Cox went back to the record plant to start working on material that would find its way onto the next album. Then on the weekends, they'd go out on the road to provide an income for the studio and loan repayments. All that time, on and off, construction on the new studio continued. There would be 2 studios, the largest Studio A and the more compact Studio B. Jimi wanted it to be very conducive to inspire creation. The lights would be equipped to show different colors and change whenever the mood struck him. There were a lot of curves all over the studio as opposed to hard corners on the walls. Even the outside famously had a curved brick wall right next to the entrance. The control room was larger in comparison to ones in other studios, so Jimi could work there as well as it being almost an extension of the studio. He was very anxious to get in there, constantly calling Kramer, asking if it was ready. Eddie kept having to say, "Not yet." Then in June 1970, after a test recording on the big grand piano that you can clearly hear on the song Freedom, Eddie gave the thumbs up. Jimi practically ran over from his place on 12th Street to get to work. Now, we went over Jimi's sessions there a couple episodes back. Steve Winwood and Chris Wood from Traffic were the first visitors, getting engineer Dave Palmer, who lived across the street, up in the middle of the night to come over and play drums. Studio A was fully ready to go. Studio B still needed some work, so the concert routine continued over the summer to keep bringing in revenue. A trip of Europe was also planned to bring in a haul of cash, but we know how that ended up. After Jimi's passing, the team worked on what would become the next 3 albums, Cry of Love, Rainbow Bridge, and In the West. But without their main source of income, they needed to get other artists in to keep the cash flow going and get the studio on its feet. One of the first artists there was someone about as far from Jimi musically as you can find, Carly Simon. Eddie produced her first album, which was recorded at the studio. It's the one that has That's the Way I've Always Heard It Should Be. It was actually recorded during the time Jimi was in Hawaii filming Rainbow Bridge. A year later, a local band, Wicked Lester, recorded a demo album there that wasn't picked up for release. They did, however, strike it big a few years later with a slightly different lineup and a different name, Kiss. They actually returned to the studio a number of times, most notably for Dress to Kill, Destroyer, Alive 2, and some of their solo records from 1978. But the artist who helped put the studio on the map as a premier facility was Jimi's old BBC jamming partner, Stevie Wonder. He was in a move to become more independent from Berry Gordy's Motown template, and recording in New York was part of this. He recorded a number of tracks for his two 1972 albums, Music of My Mind and Talking Book, at the studio, including probably the most famous song from that year, Superstition, as well as material for 1974's Fulfillingness's first finale. Whew, now I know why Eddie Murphy had trouble with this. Now, oddly, it doesn't look like anything from 1973's Inner Visions was done there, but they actually did come up with the cover for the album there. From that point on, it became a hub for New York recording and mixing. Eddie did a number of Led Zeppelin album mixes there while he was working with the band. David Bowie and John Lennon dropped by for a session that ended up yielding fame. Patti Smith's debut album Horses was done there. She was actually at the opening night party and got to talk to Jimi for a little bit. Later, Chic recorded Le Freak there, and apropos for this time of year, the Waitresses did Christmas Wrapping at that studio. AC/DC's Back in Black was mixed there. Foreigner did all of their 4 album there. Just head over to the wiki page with the album recorded to mix at the studio, and you can see it's quite a lot. Eventually, though, hard times hit everyone in the late 90s and early 2000s. An experimental band called the Soulquarians kind of took over the place as their home for experimentation. Questlove from The Roots and singer D'Angelo were the point people behind this, and they'd bring artists in and record album after album, jam session after jam session. Sound familiar? One problem, however, led to the end of this era. Nobody wanted to release those albums. The studio's finances continued to struggle, and eventually a group of investors bought it in 2010. This group decided to try once again to make it a premier recording facility for modern artists. They added a third studio and another mixing board. They also decided to redesign the studio front, which included getting rid of the famous curved brick wall. Not sure why they thought it was necessary, but it was their studio. And it did end up working. Artists such as Adele, Lana Del Rey, John Mayer, Jay-Z, Beck, U2, and some chick named Taylor something recorded albums there in the past decade and a half. It also became a big hangout place, as Jimi and Mike Jeffrey originally wanted. That Swift girl and her boyfriend, I heard he plays football or something like that, they made a big splash on page 6, showing up together for a wedding that was held at the studio. So, you know, what goes around comes around. Which brings us to the documentary, Electric Lady Studios at Jimi Hendrix Vision. This must have been in production, or at least being thought of, for quite a while. The documentary includes footage of some folks that are no longer with us. Mitch, Jerry Stickles, Thane Pridgeon, and Eddie looks distinctly different in several various segments. You can tell the earlier footage from the latter pretty clearly. But you get all the stories. You hear a lot from Jim Marin, John Storick, and people like Dave Palmer, Kim King, John Jansen, Shimon Ron. All the behind-the-scenes stories that make up a history. Then right at the end, you get to see a montage of a lot of the albums that were done there. Thank God they got this all down on film, so this very key part of Jimi's history is now pretty much told in full. Back in the 90s, when my buddy David would come up from Little Rock, we made it a point to head into the city, go down to the village, and go through all the record stores. I think Revolution on Thompson is just about the only one of those left. And, of course, the trip down to 8th Street was always in the cards. In fact, one time we were hanging out by the doors, taking pictures, and we got the call from above. "Can I help you?" No, just taking pictures. We'll be on our way." I missed that wall, but thankfully the studio is still going. So that takes care of our look at the box set. At some point, I'll go back and have a look at the other documentaries. As far as the podcast goes, I'm probably going to take a break for a month or two. I have some things that I need to take care of and not going to have too much time. But we still have things to do. We got to go over the 67 to 68 tours. the Woodstock Band studio recordings, all the Bandit Gypsy sessions, the 1970 Record Plants recordings that led to the Electric Lady material. Plus, there's always going to be another new release. I mean, let's face it, if they announce in January Royal Albert Hall is finally coming out, you'll get an episode from me. Don't worry about it. Next time, we'll have something at some point. Hope everyone had a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year at some point. Happy New Year.